Welcome to the Political Checkmate, and today I'm going to checkmate the Gravel Institute's video called Is Big Government Really the Problem? So here we go.
There's one thing Americans can agree on. We value democracy. And in a democracy, leaders are elected by the people to represent the people's interests. One person, one vote. So, why does everyone agree that the government doesn't really work for us? Conservatives have an easy answer. Big government is the problem. They say the government infringes on people's freedoms and is constantly getting bigger. They say that if we just defund expensive government programs, we could lower taxes for the average American. With that money back in the hands of ordinary people, they say, people could handle their problems on their own. But
I, for one, don't support the concept of democracy because a mob rule violating the rights of individuals. As the classic analogy of democracy goes, democracy is like two wolves and a lamb choosing what's for dinner. I would highly recommend you to watch my video on democracy, and while for the government, I would recommend you to watch this video by economist Anthony Davies on why the government fails because of public choice theory.
there's a big problem with that. It's just not true. Sure, the US government is big, but not as big as it used to be. As a percentage of the economy, federal spending is smaller now than it was in 1954. And the US spends less on government than other countries, like Germany or Finland, that have lower rates of poverty and higher rates of economic mobility. The American dream is more alive in these big government countries than in America. And there's no truth to the claim that the bigger the government, the less free the people. In fact, the countries that the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, ranks as freer than the United States, countries like Sweden or Denmark, have much larger governments relative to their populations than the United States. A large government doesn't.
The source that the Gravel Institute cited on government spending literally shows government spending has gotten bigger. Also, other parts of government have grown massively, such as regulations, according to the George Washington University. On the three graph metrics the Gravel tries to use is simply committing the correlation equals causation fallacy because the Gravel Institute does not have any control variables. Anyway, on the American poverty, that is relative poverty, where it is not based on the actual living standards, but instead the context of where the person lives. If we were to actually look at consumption poverty, where it is based on actual living standards of the poor, it would be below 2.8% in 2018, according to the economists Bruce Mayer and James X. Sullivan. While on the mobility argument, people would point to Scandinavian countries as countries with high mobility because of their welfare states. My response would be that this study found that Sweden had high levels of intergenerational occupational mobility before the welfare states, and also according to research by Nimba Sanjay, it found that American Scandinavians have more wealth and less poverty than their Nordic counterparts. The 4.4 million or so Americans with Swedish origins are considerably richer than average Americans, as are other immigrant groups from Scandinavia. If Americans with Swedish ancestry were to form their own country, their per capita GDP would be $56,900, more than $10,000 above their income of the average American. This is also far above Swedish GDP per capita at $36,600. Swedes living in the USA are thus approximately 53% more wealthy than Swedes, excluding immigrants in their native country. OECD 2009 U.S. Census database. It should be noted that those Swedes who migrated to the USA predominantly in the 19th century were anything but the elite. Rather, it was often those escaping poverty and famine. A Scandinavian economist once said to Milton Friedman, "In Scandinavia, we have no poverty." Milton Friedman replied, "That's interesting, because in America, among Scandinavians, we have no poverty either. Indeed, the poverty rate for Americans with Swedish ancestry is only 6.7%, half the U.S. average U.S. Census." I would recommend reading this book, Debunking Utopia, Exposing the Myth of Nordic Socialism, from Nimba Sanjay. While for the Cato Institute ranking, it is because of Denmark and Sweden having to compensate in other areas by having small governments to compensate their large government in different areas. A large government will always mean an unfree population because it has to generally coarsely tax people to sustain itself, and will control what a person can and cannot voluntarily do.
Mean an unfree population. You see, government isn't a problem in and of itself. In a country as sprawling and diverse as America, there needs to be an institution to build infrastructure and inspect food and to put out fires, to do things that help our communities even if they don't turn a profit. Think of the US Postal Service, which provides hundreds of thousands of good jobs while allowing people to cheaply mail packages across the country. Or think of Medicare and Medicaid, which are credited with having saved millions of lives.
A lot of these statements of why we need a government simply beg the question, why do you arbitrarily believe that the government needs to do these actions, even though the private sector could do many of these things? After all, the government is simply a group of people, not special creatures with superpowers. I believe that the private sector should be doing the supposed government responsibilities because it would generally be more efficient and more moral. Anyway, economist Walter Block has written a book on privatization of the roads, and I would highly recommend this Mises article on how the private sector could inspect food. A business like Underwriter Laboratories would inspect the food to make sure it's safe and give it to a seal of approval. If a business did not have a seal of approval, many customers would not buy that product. After all, many people would eat at popular fast food chains on different locations like McDonald's because they expect the same standard of quality of food. While for the fires, businesses and charities could put the fires out. Also, these people who work for government do these things for profit because many government employees are not working for free, they instead expect pay. And politicians can vote for the wage increases in Congress. While for the mail argument, the post office holds a monopoly over letter mail, and when they did have competition, such as with Lysander Spooner's mail company, Lysander Spooner was able to lower his prices compared to the post office's expensive prices, which then caused the government to shut down Lysander Spooner's business to protect the post office. Also, businesses can create high-wage delivery jobs like the UPS, where drivers make as much as $172,000 without a degree. While on Medicaid and Medicare, citation needed because if we look at mortality rates, it tells a different story. This study from New England's Journal of Medicine looked at Oregon's Medicaid experiment and found no significant improvements in health outcomes. This Health Affairs article points out that the involuntary insured were only 3% more likely to die than people with health insurance. While for Medicare, this study found that the first 10 years after its implementation had no discernible impact on mortality. Anyway, the government has ruined healthcare costs through multiple ways, such as licenses and certificate of need laws and patents.
So, the problem isn't the size of government, it's who controls the government. The reason it feels like our politicians don't work for us is because, well, they don't. Republicans and Democrats alike are working for the people who line their wallets instead. That's not just my politics. That's the academic consensus. In 2014, a Princeton University study found that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy. More than that, they found that the desires of regular people have zero impact on policy adoption. Not a little impact, not barely any impact, no relation.
It can't be the academic consensus if multiple independent studies have criticized the study you're talking about. The research shows it to be an imperfect democracy where the rich and middle class disagree, winning half the time. Also, it is more logical to conclude that the politicians are simply following their own self-interest and beliefs. This study from the Journal of Law and Economics found that campaign contributions simply match to people who already agree with them. The true problem here is the government. If they can be corrupted, then no one can truly stop them because they have the monopoly on force.
In the 1950s, when the economy was growing faster than ever, the richest people in the country paid an income tax of 91%. The corporate income tax was above 50%. But after decades of tax cuts for the rich, the 400 richest Americans pay a lower tax rate than the bottom 10%. Corporations, elites, and the politicians they control will justify this inequality by saying that different rules for them mean more wealth for all. But recent history shows that's not the case. While American workers have become dramatically more productive, their wages have stagnated or fallen. The average hourly wage was higher in 1974 than it was in 2018. This has led to a stark gap in qualities of life. From 1989 to 2018, the wealthiest 1% of Americans increased their total net worth by $21 trillion. The bottom 50%, meanwhile, saw their net worth decrease by $900 billion. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer.
The 91% tax rate is simply the marginal rate. You should instead look at the effective tax rate, and if you do, the effective tax rate is much lower. And in fact, in 1950 and 2014, it was a 6% difference of effective tax rate. While for the claim that the rich pay less taxes than the bottom 10%, economist David Swinner criticized the way they got the estimates, such as their allocation of underreported income, the allocation of retirement income, and the definition of income. Many estimates have found that the USA have a progressive tax structure, such as the OECD Tax Policy Center Joint Committee on Taxation, and economist Jason Furman debunks this claim by combining the CBO federal tax rate and the ITEP state and local tax estimates, and found that the taxes are progressive. While for the claim of wage stagnation, their own source Pew Research pointed out that the one causes is that it's not including the benefits. And economist Michael Strain has found that wages and productivity are strong. The question of wage stagnation is simply how you measure by what inflation calculator and including benefits and many other things. While the claim that the bottom 50% lost wealth, it was the authors simply removing the consumer durables from the data. That's why they lost so much wealth. If we look at the objective data from the CBO on wealth distribution, they found that wealth held by families in the bottom half of the distribution increased from 1.4 trillion to 2.3 trillion, a 65% increase. Also, if you factor in Social Security into the data, the shares of wealth did not change from 1989 to 2019. But let's say hypothetically that the bottom did lose a bunch of wealth. Does it mean that it's the fault of small government? Not really, because government does crony capitalist actions that pretty much steals money to the rich through things like subsidies or bailouts or tariffs or regulations causing regulatory capture and etc. and many other things. This is the end of the video. Thank you for watching, and please donate to my Patreon so I can make more videos and have your video requests checkmated. And thanks for watching, and have a nice day.